Good evening. I'm very happy to open the sixth session of our online series dedicated to 40 years to the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq war. I'm very excited today because we are hosting both old and new friends, both Ronen and myself. So we are very, very excited about this particular session. And it also brings us close to the end of this fascinating series. So welcome everyone, the new and old participants. Already started talking about issues relating to commemoration of the war. And this is an opportunity, while talking specifically on the topic of staging the war, memory, and cultural history, also to say that Ayatollah Khomeini underscored that sacrifice is nothing without remembrance. And this acknowledgement endorsed a notable commemoration culture designed for the purpose of keeping the memory of the martyrs of the war, of the shuhada, alive after death, and enhancing the values of self-sacrifice among the Iranian population and righteous believers, most notably Shiites around the world. The present official calendar of Iran includes 40 memorial days in commemoration of martyrs, only 12 of which are dedicated to martyr saints of early Islamic history, whereas state agencies list almost 250,000 official martyrs, the bulk of whom are casualties of the Iran-Iraq war. We will hear today a lot about commemoration and memory from our three distinguished speakers. And I don't want to take more time, screen time, so allow Ronen to present our first speaker, Dr. Achim Rohde. So Ronen, the screen is yours. And thank you all for joining us.
Okay, so first of all, for the sake of the holy balance, you quoted Khomeini, and Iraqis go along with the famous saying of Saddam Hussein on the martyrs, "Ash-shuhada akram minna jami'an," which means the martyrs are more noble than all of us. And this saying is still appears in the symbol of Yawm al-Shahid, which just happened to be this week on the 1st of December. So still today they use this, of course not officially, because anything Saddam said is not official right now, but those who defy the current government for neglecting these days, for marginalizing and even forgetting about these days, use this famous Saddam saying in what they say. And it is a pleasure for me to present Dr. Achim Rohde, who is also, among other things, he's a good friend of mine. Achim Rohde is a Middle East historian focusing on the modern and contemporary history of the MENA, Middle East and North Africa region, as well as on the history of Oriental studies in Germany. Since 2019, he serves as academic coordinator of Academy of Exile's Critical Thinking Residency Program at Freie Universitat, Berlin. Rohde is the author of State-Society Relations in Ba'athist Iraq, Facing Dictatorship, published by Routledge in 2010, which for me is one of the best books on the subject of culture under the Ba'athist dictatorship, and co-editor of Iraq Between Occupations, Perspectives from 1920 to the Present, published by Palgrave Macmillan 2010. I am one of the other co-editors, and the other is Ahmadi Baram. He has published numerous articles focusing on Iraq before and after 2003. Among his recent publications is National Politics and Sexuality in Trans-Regional Perspective, The Homophobic Argument, co-edited with Christina von Braun and Stephanie Schüller-Springorum, also published by Routledge in 2018. Currently, Rohde is working on a collective book project entitled Jews in the Muslim World in the 20th and 21st Century. Okay. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Ronen. Hello, everyone. Good evening. And thanks for the occasion to speak here. I'm very happy to be here tonight. Thanks to the conveners, Liora, Ronen, for inviting me, and to Ronen for your kind introduction. Let me just share my screen with you. And I'm sorry for the light here in my room, but it's very dark here already. And this is as good as it gets. And this is my screen, which you can see now. All right. Okay, here we go. In case you haven't heard about Academy in Exile before, that's a program for exiled scholars and refugee scholars that is run by a consortium of institutions, including Freie Universität Berlin, where I'm working. And I was initially surprised, to be honest, because of the reason you chose for organizing this webinar series, because the Iran-Iraq war, for all its horrors and its sheer duration, has clearly faded into distant memory in most countries I'm aware of, and including in most of academia, I would say. But as we know, memory and oblivion are two sides of the same coin, and silence doesn't necessarily imply forgetting, as this very, very interesting, excellent book tells us a lot about. In this sense, I will talk about Iraqi cultures of remembrance on the Iran-Iraq war. In a 1984 Marib article on the impact of the Iran-Iraq war, at a time when the fighting was only halfway in what was to become a total of 8 years, the Farouk Sluglets and Joe Stork chose the title Not Quite Armageddon. In hindsight, given the radically different ways in which Iraqis experienced that war, and given the string of disasters that followed in the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s, it is indeed difficult to decide what the real Armageddon was in recent Iraqi history. And the Iran-Iraq war might seem as fading into a more distant and more forgiving memory, even eventually transfiguring the longest war of two fully mobilized standing armies of two neighboring nation states in the 20th century into an experience that still somehow seemed to bear some remnants of an orderly, normal life as compared to the chaos and mayhem that Iraqis have been enduring in more recent decades. To talk about Iraqi cultures of remembrance regarding the Iran-Iraq war is not an easy task, simply because there are so many ways and so many aspects of the period of the 1980s which Iraqis are remembering, and most of them are somehow tied to the war experience. Regarding the evolution of state-sponsored commemorative culture, one has to state at the very beginning of this input that a belief in the nation-building potential of military service and war making has been common among Iraqi state-building elites since the founding of the nation state. And part of the Ba'athist regime's rationale was to use war as the ultimate means to construct a unified and homogeneous Arab nation. Thus, it embarked on, its marked enthusiasm since the early 1980s for creating large monumental architecture commemorating the Iran-Iraq war, while it had not even ended yet, might be understood as a conscious attempt to foster a sense of national pride and belonging among the Iraqi population through, evocations of heroism and martyrdom in giant monuments. This is nothing particularly Iraqi. I mean, Bismarck in his day invaded France just to get through with German unification. And there are other examples as well. And I'm going to return to this question of state-sponsored commemorative culture later on. On the level of individual memory, veterans of that war, and there are many, carry their own memories with them. And Dina Khouri, in her book Iraq in Wartime, Soldiering, Martyrdom and Remembrance, published in 2013, has given us the beginning of what might one day evolve into an oral history of Iraqi war veterans. We might still have to wait for that for some time, because the memory of the dead of that war has since been superseded and somehow covered by the dead of the wars that followed, a dizzying and harrowing chain of loss and grief, piling up one on top of the other, up to a point where violence becomes so normalized that it is hard to see how life might ever have been different. At some point, the power to remember anything at all is waning, because the brain is preoccupied by processing the daily chain of traumatic events, and to simply survive, and as we know, on an individual level, forgetting or rather repressing sometimes helps to survive. The 1980s were the most excessively oppressive period during the 35 years of Ba'athist rule. Saddam Hussein grasped the opportunity of the war against Iraq's seemingly weak and disorganized neighbor in order to establish a personalized dictatorship which he legitimized by the emergency situation of that war, a state of emergency that helped him to build a truly frightening Leviathan. Suffice it to mention here the killings of opponents, the forcing apart of families along ethnic categories. I mean, you know, when one partner allegedly had Persian origins, the brutal crackdown on the Shiite clergy and the Shiite opposition parties, etc. Now, the post-2003 Iraqi-led government, the Shiite-led Iraqi government, invested most of its commemorative energies in building memorials for the victims of domestic violence under the Ba'ath, not only from the 1980s, but also, you know, from the uprising of 1991. Commemoration was not limited to marble and stone memorials, but also to other forms, you know, like, you know, on the civil society, on the cultural level, museums, films, etc. The exhumation of mass graves, however limited, has also been a step in this context to be mentioned. And even the trials of high-ranking Ba'athis, you know, after the invasion, were opportunities for the state through the media and the relatives also and survivors in their testimonies to commemorate the victims. In a way, all this belongs to what we might call the emerging cultural memory concerning the 1980s. Militarily, as we all know, the Iraqi invasion into Iran turned to a prolonged disaster that cost the lives of more than 1 million Iraqis and Iranians and led precisely nowhere. Battles on the Fao Peninsula were something in the order of magnitude of World War I trench warfare, where tens of thousands died for a few hilltops. But unlike in Verdun and other killing fields scattered along the German-French borderland, no cemeteries of fallen soldiers commemorate the individual lives that were destroyed in Fao or anywhere else along the front lines, because the Ba'ath regime went to great length to centralize and nationalize commemoration while preventing the emergence of a more participatory and personalized culture of remembrance like cemeteries or other lieux de mémoire at original sites of battle. It even made the secret of the number of fallen soldiers, apparently out of fear of losing control over the war narrative. In Fao alone, in February, March 86, and in April 88, these were the two peaks of the battles there, an estimated 53,000 soldiers died in combat. That's pretty much the scale of Verdun. The Kurdish opposition, to move on to another player in this field, conducted its own war against the Ba'athist regime, and only a very few Kurdish soldiers served in the Iraqi army. Iraqi Kurds, therefore, have their own memories of the 1980s. Memories of a different kind, of a desperate fight for survival and autonomy against the powerful state machine and a ruthless military power, which was ultimately crushed under the cover of the war in the late 1980s in what became known as the Anfal, a genocidal series of massacres against Iraqi Kurdish villages and population centers using conventional and chemical weapons, which cost the lives of at least 100,000 Kurds, according to Kurdish accounts of up to 180,000 lives. This too forms part of what might one day become an all-Iraqi culture of remembrance of the Iran-Iraq War. Meanwhile, as you can see on this slide, it has led to the emergence of an Iraqi Kurdish collective culture of remembrance. This is the Anfal Memorial in Halabja, a very kind of heroic architecture initiated by the Kurdish autonomous government. We have another example of a more civil society-led initiative of a commemoration site of a memorial forum initiated by kind of Anfal surviving Kurdish women with the help, logistical, organizational, and financial by a German NGO called Haukari, as you can see on this flyer, as well as by the German Foreign Office. It's still in the process of being built. What you can see here is a model. So the Iran-Iraq War and all the events associated with and linked to that period are definitely being remembered in a myriad ways on the individual and communal levels. Ronen has previously talked about the literary culture of remembrance in the framework of this webinar series, I was informed. And on this level, we find some references to the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. However, until today, no inclusive and shared new discourse on the country's recent past and its numerous wars and violent conflicts has been developed that could integrate the various and contradicting memories thereof among the various sectors and segments of the Iraqi population. The post-2003 political elite in Iraq is in a bit of a dilemma regarding its attitude toward that war, because in Iraq, despite what one might have thought about Saddam in secret at home, still it was an eight-year-long war, and many Iraqis willingly or not willingly, but at the end of the day fought for many years to defend their homeland against an imminent Iranian occupation. After the downfall of the Ba'ath regime, that war has been presented as one in a series of Ba'ath's crimes. And most Iraqi opposition parties, who today form the political elite of Iraq, of course, fought against the Iraqi army on the Iranian side. Yeah. There is also the diplomatic dilemma of commemorating fallen Iraqi soldiers from a war in which Iran was the enemy, when Iran at the moment is a powerful player in today's Iraq. So what should you do? As a result of this impasse, there is stagnation and silence. And for lack of an alternative, we still have the remnants of Ba'athist culture of remembering that war, which have been accepted somehow to varying degrees as part of the Iraqi cultural heritage. Now, let me just shortly outline the most crucial commemorative sites that were created in the 1980s by the Ba'ath regime itself, whose meaning, for better or for worse, has today increasingly been transformed into sites that serve to commemorate all the dead of all the wars. Here's the first one, the Monument of the Unknown Soldier, Nasb al-Jundi al-Majhul, inaugurated in 1982. That means it was planned in 1980, probably something. You know, at the very beginning of the war, they already started to plan those monuments. This highlights the pedagogical function that is behind these monuments, right? In popular parlance, it's called the flying sausage, the flying saucer. It's today located in the green zone and not very accessible. In 2008, and that's an interesting thing to report maybe here, the Iraqi army, the new Iraqi army of the post-2003 period, resumed the tradition of celebrating Army Day, a Ba'athist day of, remembrance, the Army Day near the monument of the unknown soldier. This symbolic nod to the dismantled historic Iraqi army, which has been the oldest Iraqi state institution of all, is of course politically risky. Therefore, these celebrations were kind of behind closed doors without much publicity, but they actually are reviving this tradition of the Iraqi Army Day. Another gigantic and very well-known site of commemoration is the Nasb al-Shahid, the Martyrs Monument, inaugurated in 1983. So again, it was planned at the very beginning of the war. It's also located in Baghdad, of course, in an artificial lake, and it's, unlike the Unknown Soldiers Monument, it's accessible to the public. It's not hidden in the green zone. This monument, of course, called the Split Dome, is 40 meters high, and it's a vast area. There's a lot of symbolism to it. It was designed by an Iraqi artist. And thanks to its undeniable aesthetic value today, the Nasb al-Shahid acquired the status of a Baghdadi icon, and since 2003 has turned into a place of commemoration for all Iraqis who died of war and violent strife in Iraq's recent history. Until 1989, until the end of that war, no official commemoration site bore signs of individual commemoration or individual soldiers, individual marches. There were no monuments to commemorate individuals, no human statues. But then in 1989, the Basra Sculpture Park was created. Set in a green park on the Corniche of Basra, facing the Shat al-Arab, and pointing to the Iranian shore, surrounded by black billboards, reminding the public of how many Iraqis died for Basra. 80 life-size bronze sculptures of high-ranking commanders who fell in combat were erected on high pedestals. You can see pictures of the sculpture garden taken in the 1980s here, together with a cartoon-like design that was published in one of the newspapers, in the Iraqi newspapers in the 1980s. All these statues that kind of stretch their hands accusingly towards the Iranian shore. Clearly, this memorial wasn't designed in the first place as a place to remember for bereaved families, but to cast the blame for starting the war and for the destruction of Basra on the Iranians. And notably, after years of neglect, it has never been systematically dismantled or destroyed, this sculpture park. And it recently, I think last year, has even been renovated. In sum, though subject of public controversy, none of the Saddam-era gigantic commemorative monuments in Baghdad and Basra has been destroyed or dismantled. Not even the Victory Arch, this ugly monument modeled after allegedly modeled after the hands of Saddam Hussein himself, that is depicted here on the cover of one of the most informative books about Iraqi monumental culture from the Ba'athist period, Kanan Makia's The Monument. Quite entertaining and very informative, I can say. Significantly, there is no new memorial for the fallen soldiers of all of Saddam's wars. And the new Iraqi calendar, like the official calendar, has no commemoration day for the Iran-Iraq war. It is only commemorated in private by families or in cemeteries or by writers and poets, but not by the state. There's no official ceremony of any kind. This is not without risks for today's political elite. While passing in silence over the wars of the last decade serves to distance the current Iraqi government from the previous one, such a policy also widens the gap between the new political leadership and large crowds who visit the cemeteries and for whom those wars are still a deeply traumatic part of their own present, of their living memories, of their family memories. In cultures of remembrance concerning wars, in particular big ones such as the Iran-Iraq war and other national disasters, are always also about political legitimacy. So let me close by illustrating this last point with a Facebook post that appeared a few days ago. Yom al-Shahid. The day, Yom HaShahid, is a Ba'athist holiday introduced in 1981 as part of the Iraqi war propaganda. And Ronen is was so kind to send me that the link to that Facebook post yesterday, which I find very illustrative for what happens here. That despite the fact that this is a Ba'athist date, and it was cancelled, of course, in 2003 by the post-Saddam Iraqi government. Some people mark it, nevertheless, even today, or once again today, not necessarily because they are die-hard Baathists, but in order to protest against the complete lack of any kind of official commemoration of that war, which, after all, was a generational trauma that left its enduring marks on Iraqi society. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to comments and questions, and I hope I haven't taken so much time. Thanks.
To our next speaker that in the meantime was able to join us. Hello, Shaherzad. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. How are you?
Oh, hi. I think the last time that we've met also with Gershon was in Vienna, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a pleasure to have you here. Shaherzad Ahmadi, or Shaz, as she goes by, earned her doctorate from the University of Texas at Austin in 2018. Congratulations.
Thank you.
She is now an assistant professor of history at the University of St. Thomas. She's the author of numerous papers on the history of the Iran-Iraq frontier, including a forthcoming article in the International Journal of Middle East Studies. Her presentation will describe the major themes of her book manuscripts, Bordering a War, A Social History of Khuzestan, 1925 to 1991. So Shaherzad, the screen is yours, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I feel bad that I don't have a PowerPoint, so apologies for the lack of imagery. I usually do, but you'll have to tolerate just my face and my voice for now. So the presentation I'm giving today examines the southwestern Iranian province of Khuzestan, bordering Iraq. And I'm especially focused on, actually, let me close my email so that you don't keep hearing ringing. The oil-rich towns of Khorramshahr and Abadan. And all of these locations should be familiar to folks working on the Iran-Iraq War. This is the region invaded by Saddam Hussein in 1980. Why am I looking at Khorramshahr and Abadan in particular? Khorramshahr and Abadan, like I said, are the oil-rich cities of Khuzestan. They also have unique demographics, unique to Khuzestan itself. Khorramshahr at the time of the war was 80% Arab, Abadan's 50% Arab. The capital city of Khuzestan, Ahvaz, was 70% Arab. And immediately after the Islamic Revolution, an Arab separatist movement erupts in this region, in the borderland. And that shouldn't be surprising to us. It was a very chaotic time in 1979. There were movements like this throughout the country, especially in borderland areas. I'm going to be looking at the local dynamics in 1979. And the first question you should ask me is, why are we looking at 1979 for a panel about the Iran-Iraq War? What does it have to do with the war itself? Well, historians often cite this civil unrest between May and July of 1979 as one of the justifications for Saddam Hussein's invasion, that he believed as a result of this anti-Islamic Republic activism, Arab Iranians in this region no longer wanted to remain part of Iran. They would embrace an invading army as liberators, and they would join the Iraqi national community. Now, I have my own thoughts on that narrative, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, but it's interesting to me that despite the importance attributed to the civil unrest in justifying Saddam Hussein's invasion, not much attention has been given to what happened in 1979. What did Arab Iranians want? what have we missed as scholars about the borderland by overlooking 1979, the local and transnational dynamics of the region? So I'm going to be talking about the political landscape in this time, what I think is important about it, what it says to us about the war itself too. And then I'll just sort of conclude with some questions that maybe we can all explore later. So in May of 1979, about 3 months or so after Khomeini installs himself as supreme leader of Iran, there are violent demonstrations in Khorramshahr and Abadan, Ahvaz, all over Khuzestan, but especially violent in Khorramshahr and Abadan. The Islamic Republic sends Ahmad Madani to the region as governor. And he's tasked with an incredible responsibility to curb illegal immigration, to suppress Arab organizations, and to shut down Iraqi schools operating in the borderland. This was a monumental task for anyone. And in fact, immediately after the revolution, when Islamic Republic officials appeared in the borderland, they were quite shocked by how unsupervised this area was by the Pahlavi monarchy. The incredible relationship that had flourished in the borderland between Khuzestan, Kuwait, Iraq. Madani immediately faces accusations of racism. The feeling is that he is unsympathetic to the Arab population he is administering. He tries to dispel these rumors to no avail. The tension is very high. Now, he was responsible, like I said, for suppressing Arab organizations. And there are several that scholars have mentioned, sort of explored. The two that are most prominently featured in histories are Khalqa Arab, which is probably the most known. Its hierarchy is more transparent. It was very active in engaging with the media. So we have some knowledge about what they were doing, as well as Fedai Nekhak. But these were not the only organizations that caused Madani problems in the region. There were several that had been founded in the region in decades past. They had been funded by Iraqi, Kuwaiti money, and not just state money, also entrepreneurs who were interested in Khuzestan. Since the mid-1920s, the sort of transnational pan-Arab movement was very interested in the Iran-Iraq frontier, specifically the borderland, as a possible space where Arabs could express their nationalistic sentiments. So there was funding for these kinds of organizations. In 1958, Ahvazis founded the Popular Front for the Liberation of Ahvaz, as well as another organization called Struggle Until Victory. In 1968, Arabs in the province founded the Arab Revolt Movement to liberate Arabistan. Arabistan was the alternative name given to Khuzestan by Arab partisans. So there was a very sort of transnational political culture in the borderland that Madani was now responsible for addressing. And like I said, Khalqa Arab was the most aggressive, the most assertive. And the Islamic Republic depended on Arab factionalism to prevent all-out conflict in the region. In other words, there were so many organizations vying for authority that the Islamic Republic felt they would not have to step in to address the situation unless, God forbid, they started working together, which in early June of 1979, there's a kind of meeting among the various Arab separatist groups and tribes, where they agree that instead of fighting with each other, they should focus on their shared goal, which is greater autonomy for Khuzestan. And this is when things start to get sort of hot in early July of 1979. Now, another feature of the borderland that's discussed quite a lot by historians are the Shi'i clerics that are quite transnational, as Shi'i clerics in general are, not just the ones in the borderland. The Islamic Republic struggled to get the support of Shi'i clerics in the borderland, which was enormously frustrating because, of course, the Islamic Republic represents the clerical hierarchy, was supportive of Shi'i clerics. Ayatollah Khaqani is the most known and prominent Shi'i cleric in the region. He had connections with Khalqa Arab, but he was far from the only one. There were many. Sheikh Abdul Zahrawi was another prominent cleric. He traveled extensively to Kuwait and maintained a lot of connections there, where he was able to bring money and equipment to support Arab separatist movements. There were independent entrepreneurs in the region, men like Maki Faisadi, who supported Arab separatism and brought Arab immigrants to work for him as laborers. So there was a really robust black market economy that clerics were tapped into. There was a tremendous amount of immigration in this region. And all of this created a kind of flux, a kind of fluidity that Iraqis were very aware of and the Islamic Republic was very aware of. One internal memo written by an Islamic Republic official reveals just how serious they thought the situation was. They write that upwards of 40% of adult Arabs in the region, in the borderland, did not support the Islamic Republic. Now, we can look at this sort of glass half full and say, well, 60% might have supported the Islamic Republic. But this was certainly not a fringe movement. There were lots of people who believed that Arab Iranian interests did not lie with the Islamic Republic. And what did these 40% of Arab Iranians want? At no point in 1979 did Arab Iranian organizations advocate for joining Iraq. So historians are right that Saddam Hussein misreads this. Now, I would say that it wasn't just this he was misreading. There were decades of historic connections between Khuzestan and Basra, the neighboring province in Iraq, that he kind of overplayed and overemphasized. But what's really important here is that the demands were always for greater cultural and economic autonomy. Quietly, these organizations certainly might have aspired to remove Persians from the region. This is something the Islamic Republic writes about at the time quite a lot. But publicly, this is not the vision they furthered for Khuzestan. Okay, so I just want to sort of complete the circle by describing some of the other organizations that were operated in this region and fought against Arab separatism. The Islamic Republic was not effective in asserting a presence in 1979-1980, and in fact outsourced a lot of state responsibilities to local actors. The major one was the Cultural Militant Islamic Revolutionaries of Khorramshahr. I'm going to call that CMIRK. It's a long name. They were founded in 1979, and the Islamic Republic essentially says that and this is a quote from them, quote, "At this point, the CMIRK is now responsible for the most sensitive matters in the city of Khorramshahr, from guards for private homes and public street matters to customs and port guards." The Islamic Republic was aware of the fact that residents of the borderland rejected many national laws, especially customs and immigration laws. And the civil unrest in this region exposed the fluidity of Khuzestan, of the borderland in 1979, which the Islamic Republic and Saddam Hussein were trying to understand, trying to read. What does this mean? What does this mean about the national loyalty of Arab Iranians? And they both come up with different answers about what this might mean. Critical to the landscape in this region also was a Bazari trade union called Merchants, Traders, and Muslims of Khuzestan. They worked against Arab separatists, and they, like other organizations, insisted that multiracialism, pluralism had a historic foundation in the region and should be the way that Khuzestanis operate. They should coexist with each other. In fact, many people, including youth groups, organizations that were media savvy and did interviews with the media, thought that the conflict in 1979 was actually highly local, that this was a fight between the Bazaris, who were pro-Islamic Republic, and Arab separatists, who were benefiting from a kind of transnational ethos that for many decades had been, the groundwork had been laid for them by previous activists. So I want to kind of conclude all this. What does this all mean? Historians in the West, unlike historians writing in Iran, have tended to overlook the social and political dynamics of Khuzestan immediately before the war, despite the fact that tremendous importance has been placed on what took place in 1979. The support the Islamic Republic received by Arab Iranians has caused them to think that perhaps Arab Iranians really did have a kind of natural home in Iran, that their heritage was truly Iranian, that they did participate in building this revolutionary narrative for Iran, and they did. There's no question that they did. That said, Arab Iranian support for the Islamic Republic should not cause scholars to overlook some wider themes. One of those themes are the transnational connections between Arab Iranians themselves, so not just Shi'i clerics, but Arab Iranian laborers, just average everyday people, students, merchants, and the wider Arab community, exemplified by schools, by black market trade, by immigration in the region. Scholars should also examine how the Islamic Republic pitched itself to the Arab Iranian community. The Islamic Republic did not take Arab Iranian support for granted. And in fact, before the Iran-Iraq War, like Saddam Hussein, the Islamic Republic was trying to understand where the national loyalties of Arab Iranians lay. And the war was an opportunity for the Islamic Republic to make an appeal to that community. And finally, we should be examining the local culture and politics that go some ways in explaining, indeed, why Saddam Hussein invaded. 1979 and the kind of fluidity, the transnational character of the borderland certainly contributed to the cause of the Iran-Iraq War. So with that, I'll actually conclude and no longer take up your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Shaz, for this wonderful presentation. And before we move to Gershon's presentation, I would just like to mention that if you have questions, you are already invited to list them down through the chat. And later on, we will, of course, address them. So our third speaker for this session is D. Gershon Lewental. He's a cultural historian of the Middle East, focusing on how societies use religion, memory, and conflict to define and maintain their identities. He's an assistant professor of Islamic history in the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at Shalem College in Jerusalem, and since 2012 has taught also at the University of Oklahoma. He earned his doctorate in Middle Eastern history from Brandeis University. His dissertation on the changing perceptions of the Arab-Islamic conquest received the Foundation of Iranian Studies Best Dissertation Award and the Brandeis University Gletzer Dissertation Prize. His field of specialization includes early Islamic history and historiography, Iranian history, the Baha'i faith, and Israeli society. And he's currently completing a book manuscript on the interplay of religion, nationalism, and memory in modern Middle East. So saying that, I'm moving the screen to you, Gershon, and thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can see my screen. Is it sharing properly?
Yes, it is.
Great. Well, first, let me start by quickly thanking Liora and Ronen for organizing this entire symposium and inviting me and the others to participate in this panel. And to Liora, her predecessors, and her colleagues for all the important work that the Allianz Center does to promote Iranian studies in Israel. As many others have noted this year, the current pandemic does provide some new opportunities, and I am particularly excited by the opportunity of holding the seminar online to expand the reach and to share our research with an interested audience located anywhere in the world. Shaz, I don't know where you are, but you're certainly not here in Israel, so it's great to be able to be with you on a panel, even though we're on two different continents. In my scholarship, I straddle two worlds, with one foot, so to speak, in the vibrant modern Middle East, and the other in the equally exciting early Islamic society. My present discussion illustrates how I bridge these two fields of inquiry as I turn our gaze backwards to address the role and importance of early Islamic history in the contemporary Middle East. And I intend to demonstrate two important points. One, the lasting power of religious history, the rich resource to which Middle Eastern leaders turn in order to inspire and mobilize their populations. The rise of modernity and the challenge of the West have led to the dissemination of new ideas such as secularism and nationalism. But when push comes to shove, Middle Eastern states resort to the tried and true bag of tricks used by their forerunners for centuries. While modern movements have garnered support and engaged mass followings, their reach pales in comparison to ideologies grounded in religious identities, or at least coded in religious garb. Two, I shall also show how such appeals represent themselves rediscoveries and reinterpretations and are thus not a return to the past, but a reimagining of the past in the present. In other words, each effort to mold the past inevitably leaves its own contemporary mark on the material. Thus, as the repeated use of such symbols demonstrates their enduring significance in the Middle East, the new meanings that they acquire divulge much about the ideas and outlook of those making use of them. So to illustrate my point, I want to focus on how the Iraqi and Iranian regimes competed over the memory of the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, a 7th century engagement during the Arab Islamic conquest in which Arab Muslim warriors overcame the superior forces of the Imperial Sasanian Iranian army, which over the centuries came to represent the overthrow of pre-Islamic Iran as a whole. Gradually, Al-Qadisiyah entered into a quasi-pantheon of heroic battles denoting the glorious achievements of Islam. In the interest of time, I'm trying to be very condensed. I know that people's patience are very short, especially in the online format. I'll be happy to elaborate on much more, and I'm going to have images that I also would be happy to elaborate more in Q&A, but I may not touch on in my presentation. Let's start by looking on the Iraqi side. Beginning in the late 1970s, Saddam Hussein redefined Al-Qadisiyah in modern ethnic and nationalist terms in a deliberate propaganda campaign. As tensions with the Islamic Republic of Iran rose and erupted into war, Saddam enlisted the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, adding it to his rhetorical arsenal in an effort to attach historical significance to an otherwise political ideological disagreement. In its official terminology, the Ba'athi regime called the 8-year war with Iran Saddam's Qadisiyah, Qadisiyat Saddam. The decision to name the hostilities after the 7th century engagement dovetailed with Saddam's philosophy of history, which stressed its utilitarian role in the service of state ideology. Due to Saddam's efforts, the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah came to signify an eternal conflict between the Arab and Persian peoples. Significantly, this reinterpretation, which sought to redraw the lines of collective memory to exclude Iranians from the legacy of early Islam, achieved a fair amount of success around the world, as many adopted the underlying contention of an Arab-Persian ethnic schism. Indeed, Saddam's frequent references to the battle made it so popular that quickly Qadisiyah nomenclature cropped up throughout the Arab world. By 1989, one British journalist noted with little hyperbole that every village, town, and city has its Saddam Avenue and more recently, Qadisiyah Square. Saddam, in fact, ejected references to Al-Qadisiyah into every facet of life. Unsurprisingly, the term found greatest currency within the military sphere. Military campaigns, battalions, bases, ships, and medals, among other things, bore the name of Al-Qadisiyah. The regime also cultivated Qadisiyah symbolism in civilian life. In 1986, it introduced this 25 dinar note on which Saddam appeared against the backdrop of a scene from the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. You can see it also on your screen. He's over there to the right, and the warriors are there in the center. 7th century warriors being overseen by a 20th century president. Similarly, the Ba'athi regime issued stamps commemorating the two Qadisiyahs, that of the 7th century, that of the 20th, and gave its names to complexes, engineering and irrigation projects, a port, bodies of water, state companies and corporations, and even a new settlement. In the cultural sphere too, Al-Qadisiyya appeared as the name of a literary competition, a series of children's books, and a massive panorama not far from Baghdad. I've identified three major prongs of what I call this Qadisiyya Saddam campaign, each of which served not only to justify the Iran-Iraq war, but also to shore up its support at home and abroad. First, Saddam used Al-Qadisiyya to symbolize an alleged ethnic clash between Arabs and Persians dating back to time immemorial, which served not only to explain the war to the West, but also to sell it to the Iraqi population as well as to Arabs outside of Iraq. The Qadisiyya Saddam rhetoric depicted Iraq on the front lines, defending the Arab world against Persian aggression. Second, Al-Qadisiyya became a useful vehicle for Saddam to promote his cult of personality, portraying himself as a latter-day Arab hero and the heir of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Arab nationalist hero. Third, in addition to providing a sense of continuity and timelessness to Arab-Iranian tensions, Al-Qadisiyya was also a successful precedent for an Arab victory over Iran. By consciously modeling the second Qadisiyya after the original historical battle, Saddam sought to imply an element of inevitability with respect to the outcome of the war. In the interest of time, I'm just going to speak briefly about the first and the third goals. The key to the Qadisiyya Saddam rhetoric hinged upon presenting the confrontation as the latest encounter in a sequence of ethnic encounters between Arabs and Persians going back to the dawn of time. By redefining Al-Qadisiyya in ethnic terms, Saddam could blunt the appeal of Iran's Islamic revolution amongst his Shi'i subjects by appealing to Arab nationalism. Furthermore, he could convert what was essentially a private Iraqi geostrategic dispute with Iran into a broader Iranian-Arab conflict. Furthermore, by characterizing the conflict as an Arab-Persian ethnic one, the regime sought to convince its Shi'i populations to view those across the border as Persians first, Shi'is second. By the same token, it insisted that all Iraqis were Arab or Iraqi first before any sectarian allegiances. The conceptualization of two Qadisiyyas as part of an age-old ethnic conflict facilitated Saddam's efforts to cultivate support amongst fellow Arab nations and to encourage the enlistment of foreign Arabs in the army. Arab governments and Western observers alike accepted this interpretation of Al-Qadisiyya without any hesitation, even using his analogy to explain contemporary enmity between Iran on the one hand and the Arab world as a whole, such as an article even in The Economist that purported that, quote, the origins of the present hostilities between Iraq and Iran can be traced all the way back to Qadisiyya. The predictive value of the Qadisiyya Saddam rhetoric was no less important. By building on the framework that recasts the Iran-Iraq war as the latest conflict in a long line of struggles stretching back to the ancient world, Saddam sought to convince his population, the Arab world, the Iranian enemy, and the international community, and maybe even himself, of the certainty of an Iraqi victory. This rhetorical campaign typified the Baath's chaotic struggle to recover the past or to restage the past in the present, and it demonstrates how a remote historical event could serve as both a stimulus and as a fuel for contemporary ideological and military confrontation. No doubt during the long years of the Iran-Iraq war, Al-Qadisiyya facilitated Saddam's anticipatory representation of the war, in which the past, rewritten and revived, assures future victory and glory. Using and abusing the memory of figures, places, and terms from the Arab Islamic conquests, a period in which the terms Arab and Muslim were largely interchangeable before non-Arab populations entered into the Muslim community, reflected Saddam's effort to create a discourse that exploited the allures of both Arab nationalism and Islam. This discourse, which I termed Arab Islamism, harkened back to a golden age that peaked during the major successes of the conquest, notably Al-Qadisiyya, combining the strength of religious fervor, religious faith with nationalist sentiment. Indeed, as I've argued elsewhere, the Qadisiyya Saddam campaign revealed a recognition of the superior capacity of Islam as a tool of mobilization. Saddam's continued use of this rhetoric, increasingly from the Iran-Iraq War until his fall and his ultimate execution, demonstrates his awareness of the powerful potential inherent in Islamic discourse. I doubt that Saddam believed in Arab Islamism any more than he believed in anything but himself. But his increasing reliance upon this idiom suggests that his regime attributed to it a certain measure of success. Now, turning to the Iranian side. By contrast, the realization of the utility of Islam defined the revolutionary Shi'i leadership of Iran from its outset. Indeed, the Islamic Revolution owed much of its success to the clever manipulation of religious symbols in the struggle to overthrow Mohammad Reza Shah. This prior exposure to Islamic discourse likely hampered Iraq's ability to exploit images that for most Iranians had already been defined and enlisted in their national struggle that had culminated in the fall of the Pahlavi dynasty. In fact, no evidence exists that suggests that Ba'athi propaganda had succeeded in winning over any meaningful segment of Iran's population, much as Shaherzad just discussed. Not even that same Arab population that inhabited the disputed frontier province of Khuzestan. The reason for its ineffectiveness has much to do with the matter of perception, as well as the important legacy of religious history. Quite simply, Saddam's nationalist interpretation of the Battle of al-Qadisiyah failed to resonate with the Iranian public because the latter saw themselves paradoxically not as the descendants of the ancient Persians, but of the Muslim victors. Therefore, confronting Saddam's Qadisiyah was a very different memory of the early Islamic engagement, one in which the religious, not ethnic, identity of the participants played a central role. According to the clerical heads of Iran, the victor of the first, so to speak, Qadisiyah belonged to the Muslim Ummah community as a whole, and they celebrated it as the arrival of Islam to the Iranian plateau. The Battle of al-Qadisiyah thus represents a classic example of one past claimed by two very different memories. Now, ironically, just a couple of years prior to the launch of the Qadisiyah Saddam campaign, the Iranian leadership had approached the subject from a perspective poles apart from that of the Islamic Republic and much closer to the Ba'athi regime in Iraq. The Pahlavi dynasty had promoted a nationalist worldview, emphasizing the continuity of Iranian nationhood from prehistoric times to the present, embodied and personified in the figure of the Shah. However, this thesis encountered an obstacle in the Arab Islamic conquest. How could nationalist intellectuals reconcile the total subjugation of Sasanian Iran and the adoption of Islam by its population with their belief in an uninterrupted tradition of Iranian identity and culture? Nationalist thinkers solved this problem in two ways. First, they depicted the conquest as a period of foreign occupation which sought unsuccessfully to extinguish Iranian distinctiveness. And second, they interpreted every single political, cultural, or religious movement that dissented from the mainstream as an expression of indefatigable Iranianness. Thus, for example, they transformed the 8th century Abbasid revolution into a Persian-led retribution for the conquest of Iran, the new Persian Renaissance of the 9th and 10th centuries into a proto-nationalist uprising, and Shiism into an Iranian expression of dissimilarity within the religious sphere. Unsurprisingly, the Battle of al-Qadisiyah did not attract positive attention from those promoting this worldview. Iranian nationalists portrayed it as a national catastrophe that snuffed out Iranian sovereignty. However, with the fall of the Shah and the reconstitution of Iran as an Islamic republic, a fundamental shift took place in the conceptualization of Iranian identity. Islam and faith supplanted the monarch as the representative and focus of the Iranian nation. No longer was the Arab Islamic conquest a cause for grief, but rather a point for celebration, a blessing that brought Muhammad's divine message to Iran. More important for our consideration, al-Qadisiyah transformed from a defeat into a victory, since the Iranian leadership stressed a new form of continuity with the Muslim Ummah. Therefore, unlike Iraq, Iran needed to prove that the cause of the contemporary conflict was exclusively the result of the aggressive and racist policies of the Ba'athi regime. It pointed to long-standing Arab and Iranian co-religiosity in Islam and marked the, quote, total failure of the Qadisiyat Saddam rhetoric. According to the Iranian government, al-Qadisiyah represented a liberative war of devout Muslim fighters and dismissed Saddam's, quote, imaginary victory as proof of his unbelief in the principles of Islam. Imam Khomeini referred repeatedly to al-Qadisiyah as a blessing and called Iranians the true heirs of Muhammad and his family. Likewise, Bani Sadr, the first president, responding to Saddam's claims, described Iranians as the nation of Islam and the sons of Qadisiyah, while asking Saddam how he, as an unbeliever, could relate to Qadisiyah. Iranian radio mocked the Iraqi regime, saying, and I quote, "O puppets of Baghdad, he who laughs first cries last. You have desecrated the noble character of Qadisiyah Islam by your atheism and your falsehood. The great Qadisiyah Islam, i.e. the Islamic Republic, is digging your graves and bringing your death closer." Throughout the war, and even since, the Iranians derided Saddam's efforts to recast the war as a modern reincarnation of what they saw as a holy war. Refusing to adhere to this analogy, they qualified the term as the swamps of Saddam's ill-omened Qadisiyah, the Black Qadisiyah, the American Qadisiyah, and the quagmire of Qadisiyah. At the same time, elements of the Iranian discourse suggest that their response to the challenge posed by the war operated on more than one dimension. Underscoring its religious rhetoric, a layer of civic nationalism, and even at times ethnic nationalism, can be detected. This does not reflect a failure on the part of Islam as a mobilizational tool, but rather it recognizes the reality of the modern division of the world into nation states. Officially, of course, Khomeini rejected nationalism as incompatible with Islam, but he too could not resist anachronistic nationalistic claims like those of Saddam, such as when he claimed that Iraq is part of Iran, harkening back to the pre-Islamic Sasanian Empire, whose capital was located in present-day Iraq. Pseudo-nationalist themes also re-emerged in Friday sermons delivered soon after the Islamic Revolution. Mahmoud Talabani, the Tehran Friday prayer leader, conveyed this fusion of Shiism and Iranian nationalism in his remark, "We are all the sons of the Iranian motherland, and we all belong to the Islamic nation of Iran." Khomeini's complex conceptualization of Iranian identity was neither totally secular nor religious, a territorial nationalism defined by Islam. Iran's schizophrenic behavior suggests that nationalist rhetoric had its effect upon the Iranian populace. In the army, charged with protecting the nation's frontiers, the cause of the motherland motivated the soldiers more than the call of Islam. Ultimately, in time of crisis, the leaders of the Islamic Republic could not rely solely upon their radical Islamist ideology to motivate the masses, but needed to turn to some form of nationalism as well. This underscores what a number of scholars have argued, namely that so fused are the notions of religion and nation in the construction of Iranian identity that one cannot separate one from the other. Despite the regime's ideological and rhetorical claims to purge the state of its nationalist sentiment, the latter has become so firmly woven into Iranians' notion of who they are that no political ideology can succeed without appealing to both. Indeed, I would go so far to say that from the outset, the Islamic Republic betrayed its supposed transnational revolutionary ideology of Shia revolution and Shia state through its integration of nationalist symbols into official rhetoric and its repeated preference for pragmatic state interests over radical ideology. But this would be a separate talk altogether. So, to conclude, a comparison of Iraqi and Iranian rhetoric suggests that both shared a two-pronged appeal to religion and nationalism. While Iran's case might best be described as religious nationalism, where the nation is grounded in its religious identity as a Shia Muslim community, and Iraq's situation represents Arab Islamism, a fusion of Arab nationalism and Islam embodied in the first century of Islamic history, both reflect the potent force of religion in the expression of national identity in the modern Middle East. The fusion of religion and nationalism has had the obvious effect of altering the contemporary perceptions of al-Qadisiyah and other historical events and personages from Islamic history. Unfortunately, however, the new Qadisiyah is a divisive nationalist symbol of an Arab-Persian clash that ignores well over a millennium of shared heritage between the two peoples, if we can use such a term. It continues to evolve, particularly among Sunni radicals who oppose Iran and its Shia proxies in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. During the 1980s, both Iraqi and Iranian propagandists stressed the element of remembrance in their rhetoric, claiming that their side remembered while the other side had forgotten the Battle of al-Qadisiyah. But their very efforts to remind their audience of something supposedly forgotten implicitly acknowledged the fact that they were consciously rewriting the past. The abuse of history, particularly by the Ba'athi regime in Iraq, generated a situation in which the two sides were expected to claim figures and events from history for themselves and themselves alone. But to conclude on a positive note, given the continuing transformation of the meaning of the past, especially these images that have shown up on the screen that I'm happy to elaborate on, one can perhaps hope that the seeds for a future revisioning of al-Qadisiyah, which dispenses with useless and injurious dichotomies, might be planted. To do so, we might actually look to the encouraging aspects of the narrative promoted by the Islamic Republic, in which Iraqis and Iranians shared equally in the heritage of Islam. The past can yet be rewritten. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gershon, for another fascinating lecture. Senior officials tend to say that there is no ethnic problem in Iran, especially in the Khuzestan province. But we do know that there are sometimes voices claiming otherwise, although I believe that at the end they did not want their, let's say that Iranian nationalism sentiment was stronger than any other sentiment they might have, either ethnic or otherwise. So if you can comment on that, it will be great.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, it's something that I sort of struggled with as I was doing my own research, that how does the Islamic Republic create a narrative around Khorramshahr that both incorporates Arab Iranians without singling them out as different? One thing I want to comment on is so when I was drafting this talk, the original talk was very different. It was mostly a review of what historians had said specifically about that, specifically about the initial invasion and the victory of Khorramshahr. And I realized that we were missing part of the story by doing that. So I'm glad that you asked that question. The Islamic Republic is very conscious in 1979 and 1980 of the ethnic strife in this region. And in fact, the media spends a lot of time and attention on the topic. So despite the fact that now perhaps there's less emphasis on the issue of ethnic strife, at the time it was constantly discussed in the press that Turks, Lurs, Kurds, Arabs did not feel at home in the Iranian nation, and that the Islamic Republic had to produce some kind of national narrative to incorporate all of these people. And it was a big question mark what Arab Iranians would do when the Arab invasion occurred. One of the things that historians have said that I agree with, I think the invasion was just so violent that there really wasn't a space for Arab Iranians to reflect on what being part of an Iraq might be. And indeed, that was never part of their political vision, to be part of an Iraq. Most of their demands were around the issue of having an independent Arab Ministry of Culture that would allow for Arabic education, that would allow for greater economic independence and access to the revenues coming out of the oil in the region. Many of the demands were, not that radical, but because of the sort of chaos of the period, it becomes exponentially more and more challenging for the Islamic Republic to suppress it. So the war offered an opportunity for us to get a snapshot in what Arab Iranians wanted. And I think in a way we kind of misread it. We think because they rejected a very violent invasion, that means that Arab Iranians were at home in Iran. And I think the situation was much more complex and perhaps more nuanced than that, but certainly they did not want to be part of Iraq. which is really important. It answered questions for Iran, for the Islamic Republic, and maybe even answered too many questions for scholars.
Thank you. I would also like to ask a question of Achim. What happened from 2003 after the fall of Saddam to all these monuments? Are they still standing the way they did before the fall of his regime?
Yeah, that's the clue about it. They are still standing. Yes. Even there were some tremblings like around 2003, 2004 when the Americans, parked their tanks at the place of the Marches Monument and almost destroyed the statics. They had to withdraw because there was a lot of public resentment to that move. And of course, there was some attempts to dismantle the infamous Victory Arch. That the picture was shown twice during tonight's webinar. But even there were sufficient forces around to prevent that from happening. So it's still standing today. And of course, it's not being used the way it was used under Saddam's rule. It's not used at all, in fact, but it's like a cultural artifact.
First, a brief comment. The panorama that I referred to, which was built in the former Sassanian capital, and it was kind of a memory to Qadisiyah. There were some reports, and someone shared with me a few years ago, maybe Achim knows some more about this, it has fallen into complete disrepair. It used to be a major site for pilgrimage, so to speak. People would come and picnic there. Saddam was trying to encourage everyone to go and to learn about the great victory. But that has fallen into disrepair. And the question that I wanted to ask was, I do think that in the Victory Arch, there were nets with helmets of captured Iranian soldiers. Their helmets had been taken. If I'm not mistaken, that's what I wanted to ask, those were removed in the aftermath, I think, right? In the aftermath.
Repatriated. Yeah. They were given back to Iran, allegedly.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The most hideous aspects maybe have been somehow softened, yeah, but it hasn't been removed in its entirety.
Yeah. Yes, of course, yeah.
Ronen?
The one thing I see that was apparently removed, I saw it in one of the pictures, but I'm not so sure, was they took off the hand or the fist of Saddam Hussein holding one of the swords. This is an exact copy, of course, much enlarged of Saddam Hussein's real life fist, and I think something there was taken off, at least in one of the swords. It still exists on the other one, but that's new. I know that they wanted to demolish that, but it never happened. I don't really know why. I know that there were people planning on demolishing Nasab al-Shuhada, the most beautiful monument, but then interesting, and indeed some of the monuments from Saddam's time were removed, but not those referring to the Iran-Iraq war. Some other ideological monuments in Baghdad were removed, but it opened an interesting debate in Iraqi society in which many people said, don't demolish Nasab al-Shuhada. It is part of us. This is, as Achim said, an iconic Baghdad site. So please leave it as it is. And I think there was some sort of consentment in government to keep this monument there. But still, I mean, who knows what will happen next? And this, forces within the Iraqi regime, which constantly act against the wish of the people. So I wish it would still be there. But I wanted to say something about commemoration and the theoretical problem of commemoration. And later I would like Rachel, if you'd be good enough to give us some more details about the debate in Iraq about commemoration after 2003. Because I think the commemoration takes us almost inevitably into the field of nationalism. Whenever you start commemorating things, at least modern commemoration, because I must remind you, and to go along with what Gershon Lewental said, commemoration is also commemorating Ashura. There's a traditional side to commemoration in both Iran and Iraq. They commemorate a battle that happened, 14 centuries ago. And they do that quite vividly as if it happened yesterday. And many people actually connect to this battle because they think about the battles they've been through and not about the Battle of Karbala. So this is the traditional commemoration. But once modern commemoration comes in, then it is inevitably connected to nationalism. And that's a very big problem in both Iran and Iraq today. Probably the way out from this paradox, from this dead end of commemoration, is to find some sort of a supranational way to commemorate the shuhada of the two countries. Now, these two countries are allies now. I don't really like the pattern of alliance between these two countries, but they are allies. They are not at war, which is good, actually. And they both lost a significant part of the population to this gruesome war. So why can't they really find a date? Possibly the idea is to celebrate the 8th of August, which is the end of the war. It's a kind of a supranational, just like the European countries are doing now with the First World War.
Very much. Hopefully my internet doesn't let me down, but I just wanted to emphasize that yes, these are nationalist holidays. The term Ba'athist holiday was used. However, I would look to the region, and you will find Yom al-Shuhada being celebrated quite widely, and it gains its own sort of localized significance. In Iraq, I think this day still conjures up a lot of memories. Back in the day, because of the nationalist element, people want to feel pride in their nation, and so of course it is widely celebrated, even for those who lost members of their family, whereas today I think it highlights fissures within Iraqi society, and what we see is a battle over those emblems that have gained potency. And what we see in an accompaniment is the erasure of association. Their potency cannot be exterminated, and therefore you erase the association. You see that with Hashd al-Shabi. Hashd al-Shabi has tried to gain control over the beautiful 40-meter turquoise dome, and they've done so with not very much success.
Thank you, Nazli, for the comment, and I'll go back to you, Rachel, please.
Okay. So I'll just try to quickly make a few points that I was supposed to make in the presentation that I unfortunately couldn't provide in one of the earlier sessions. I come by Iraq's inability to establish a new National Martyrs Day in 2003 through my research and the manuscript that I'm trying to complete on Mohammed-Bakr al-Sadr. And the last chapter of that basically looks at the struggle for not the commemoration specifically, but the appropriation of his legacy, and of course all of the political and cultural capital that comes with, for those of you maybe not sure, Mohammed-Bakr al-Sadr is sort of the founding father of Iraqi Shi'i Islamism, very important figure who was executed by Saddam in 1980. So now when I'm looking at the sort of evolving dynamics and contours of this, 1980 until 2003 of course it's really because of the Iran-Iraq war, but I don't have time to deal with that right now. Just quickly, when you get to the 2003 period, that's where things become interesting, because actually in 2005, as part of the sort of contentious constitution drafting process in Iraq, for a moment it seemed like there was movement in establishing April 9th as Iraq's new National Martyrs Day. As was mentioned by Achim, of course, the December 1st date was immediately canceled. And then thereafter, the Iran-Iraq war and the Iraqi National Martyrs Day becomes this major dilemma for the Shi'i ruling political elite. And what's interesting is that two things that are very important happen on April 9th. And that is that Muhammad Bakr al-Sadr was executed by Saddam's regime. And also April 9th is when the iconic statue of Saddam fell in Tahrir Square. So interestingly, most Shi'i parliamentarians in 2005 wanted to establish April 9th as the new Martyrs Day for Iraq. Now, some wanted that because it was, of course, when Sadr was executed, and found it inconvenient that it was also the day that Saddam fell because it was at the hands, of course, of the US-led invasion, but were willing to swallow that bitter pill. Other Shi'i parliamentarians were perfectly fine with all of that and found it to be convenient, actually. Interestingly, the one who presented the most opposition and took his supporters to Tahrir Square to protest April 9th as the new day was Muhammad Bakr al-Sadr's very own kin, Sadr and his supporters, Muqtada al-Sadr and his supporters, that ferociously protested April 9th, lest it be seen that Iraqis are celebrating the occupation. So from eventually, though, in the 2005 Constitution that was ratified later, it provides for the establishment of a Martyrs Foundation that is, until today, has been firmly under the grasp of the Islamic Al-Dawa Party. And the website is fascinating. If you go through it, I recommend anyone who's interested to take a look at it. And in the law that provided for the establishment of the Martyrs Foundation, there was a clear definition of who is a martyr, and that's, of course, anyone who died opposing the Ba'athist regime. And of course, this is precisely what presents the biggest challenge when dealing with the commemoration of the Iran-Iraq War. And of course, if you look forward to Iraq's other conflicts in post-2003. So the intra-Shi'i struggle over this is actually what I find to be the most operative set of fissures that's prevented Iraq from establishing a National Martyrs Day. And I'll sort of skip through some of the trends that I've observed from 2003 until the past year, which has become very interesting, because from 2003 until now, for the most part, every December, you have op-eds, and of course, then on social media as well, you know, complaints, yearning for an official day for it to be December 1st, and complaints about the corruption of the Shi'i political elite and so forth. And then every April, you have these informal commemorations that are participated in, of course, and sponsored by the state. They're informal. You don't have an actual Martyrs Day, but you have this sort of a range from late March to early mid-April of all of these celebrations, I'm sorry, not celebrations, ceremonies. So that's been going on from 2003, and then this year, you know, 2020 has been a wild year, but it started that I've seen that the contours of the discourse on this issue have of course changed with the October protest movement. So in late 2019, already on December 1st, you already saw calls by civil society activists, you know, journalists, professors, and so forth, intellectuals, calling for December 1st to be this post-sectarian day of commemoration for Iraq's martyrs. Then, of course, I was anxiously awaiting the 40th year of Sadr's, the commemoration for Sadr. But of course, before that, Donald Trump gave Iraq some new martyrs, specifically, you know, with the January assassination of Soleimani and Abu Muhandis.
Muhandis.
Yes. So in April, then basically you see these in social media, on the press, and so forth. These attempts to, he's the new Iraqi symbol of martyrdom, appearing alongside figures like Sadr and Ayatollah Hakim and others. And then it's just been very interesting because this year I see that you have, again, civil society activists, protesters, intellectuals, and so forth talking about the martyrdom of Hisham al-Hashimi, the historian and advisor to the prime minister who was assassinated in July, basically seemed to be at the behest of pro-Iranian forces. And you're seeing the contours of new narratives emerging. And I'm whoever just made the comment about the image on Twitter, that's been going on. I've seen a lot of that image that was basically viral over the past few days. And this year, you really see a wider range of Iraqi voices talking about December 1st, as of course there's opposition as well, but I am seeing a lot more commitment and call for it to be December 1st. And you see certain actors trying to endow a sort of continuity in saying, that they're still fighting the Iranians, that this war, as that image was saying, that the war is still ongoing, and that the protesters who are being oppressed and assassinated and kidnapped and so forth, the protesters of the current movement, that this is really, you've seen, there are different explanations that it's Iran's revenge from the Iran-Iraq war, or that it's just continuation of Iran's effort to overthrow Iraq. So I'll just kind of leave it there. I have seen a lot of very interesting trends, but definitely I think this year, with all of the new martyrs that 2020 has brought, I think that the contours of this debate have expanded a bit in an interesting way.
There was a lot of migration of Kurds out of Iran into Iraq. And then there was a period in the 1960s and the 1970s where they were expelled from Iraq back into Iran. And a lot of these Kurds do participate in the creation of a war narrative. In fact, the most famous Iran-Iraq war memoir written by a woman is by a Kurdish Iranian who was born and raised in Iraq. So there was a tremendous contribution made by Kurdish Iranians to the war narrative and commemorating the war memory itself. So on the topic of why the Iran-Iraq war hasn't elicited as much discussion as one might expect, I wonder that myself. I've been wondering this question for a long time, since graduate school, which wasn't so long ago for me. And I often wonder if it's because the attention given to the Iran-Iraq war at the time focused primarily on a kind of Islamic fanaticism on the one hand, and on the Iran side, I recall reading articles written in Western newspapers about the sort of obsession with blood and gore in Iran, and that this became highly repetitive. And I wonder if that made an effect or had an effect on the way that Western scholars consider the war, because certainly it has elicited much attention in the Middle East and in Iran and Iraq.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shaz. So I believe that this is time to conclude another fascinating session in our series. Thank you guys for joining us and for participating and the wonderful presentations. And I can only wish you stay safe, be well, and stay in contact. Thank you. Thank you very much.